It's good to see everybody in the classroom and also on Zoom. Kathleen is doing some interesting science with Jim Casti, and I for one, am really looking forward to seeing what she has to say about cesium 137 in vegetation. So Kathleen, take it away.
Awesome, thank you, Linda. Okay, so just some background. Cesium 137 is a radioactive isotope, and it emits radiation in the form of beta and gamma rays. And plants can uptake it through the soil, and then animals and humans, if they eat the plants, they're exposed to the radiation as well. And this poses a lot of negative consequences for plants, animals, and humans, since it can spread through the whole food chain. So some of these negative consequences in animals. So there was a power plant explosion in Japan, and a lot of the vegetation in the surrounding area was exposed to cesium. So then scientists took this vegetation and they brought it to a new area and fed it to these flies that weren't near the explosion at all. And this chart shows the mortality rate of those flies. And you can see that overall, with increased cesium doses, the mortality rate increased. And this was in the first generation. So these flies were never exposed to cesium before this. And the pictures on the left show some of those consequences. So in A, even though the flies lived, that doesn't mean they were necessarily healthy. So there's a lot of deformities. In A, the fly has a dented left compound eye. And in the picture next to it, it has deformed wings. And they actually took the flies that lived from the first generation and looked at them in the second generation as well. And these trends just increased. So there was more mutations. The mortality rate was even higher for cesium doses. So this just continues. And in humans, children are more sensitive to this radiation because since they're growing and developing, they have higher metabolism, so they're going to eat more food. And if that food has cesium in it, they're going to ingest more of it. And in humans, exposure to cesium 137 and anything else that emits gamma radiation increases risk for cancer and other sicknesses as well. And really high cesium 137 in soil has also been shown to decrease blood counts in children. So how did it get in the US? There was a lot of nuclear weapons testing in the 1950s, and most of it was in the Pacific Islands, Russia, and then some in Nevada and the West Coast as well. And then during these nuclear weapons testing, the cesium was released into the atmosphere, and then it was deposited throughout the entire continent through rainfall. So even though Russia and the Pacific Islands are obviously very far away, once it was into the atmosphere, wind just pushed it all eastward, and then rain brought it down. So looking at this map on the right, most of the testing obviously was more Western, but that's where less of the cesium is. Most of it is found on the East Coast, especially in areas like Tennessee. There's a really high concentration there, and like North Carolina, and even up here. So obviously that's not great. We didn't have any nuclear weapons testing here, but there's still a lot of cesium. So everything else kind of just came and affected us. And there's a very clear trend with cesium 137 and soil potassium. So cesium has a similar charge density as potassium. They're both group 1 cations, so their common charge is +1, and they're right next to each other in the periodic table. So they have a very similar size. And Jim Casti did a lot of research with honey, and he found that in areas with low soil potassium, which is seen by the blue on like the East Coast right here, there's very high cesium concentrations in honey, which is the larger red circles. And this trend mostly explains the cesium that we find in honey on the East Coast. Because when there's no potassium, plants will uptake cesium instead, since to plants it looks similar, it has the same charge density. But there's some areas where that doesn't add up that we'll talk about later. So some other factors that can interact with cesium in the soil is iolite. So iolite is a clay mineral. It's a 2-to-1 clay, meaning that it has sheets of tetrahedral, octahedral, and then another tetrahedral sheet again. And these sheets are just stacked over and over again. So if we look at this picture on the right, the brown layers kind of represents those 2-to-1 sheets. And then when they stack on top of each other, each sheet has a slight negative charge. So iolite is going to have a slightly negative interlayer site, which isn't good. So iolite takes up potassium, and potassium fills the interlayer sites. So the it's become neutralized. Potassium, the +1 charge is really good for that, and it's a really perfect size to fit between all the sites. So since cesium is the same charge and similar size, if iolite doesn't have any potassium to fill those sites, cesium can come in and do that instead. And once cesium's there, it's bonded really well. So it's basically immobilized once it gets inside the clay. And cesium is also just going to attach to any negatively charged surface. So it doesn't bond, but there's a very strong attraction on organic matter, for example, since organic matter is slightly negative charge, clays like we just talked about, silt, anything like that. And I'll be talking about soil a lot, so just a quick overview of why that's important. So the parent material, which is the bedrock that the soil begins to form on, heavily influences the soil properties, because before the soil horizons develop, you just have the bedrock. So that provides all the minerals, the chemical composition for other processes to act on. And over long periods of time, the time varies per place depending on the processes, the soil composition will diverge from the parent material, but this is what we have to start with. And then over time, the soil horizons form. So the bedrock isn't just the only thing there. We eventually develop these horizons, and I will be focusing on the O horizon, which is the organic matter at the top, and the bedrock at the very bottom. So I have two hypotheses. One is the main one that I'll talk about today, and I sampled at 5 different sites that I'll talk about today. And I think the sites with greater slopes will have less cesium cycling through the vegetation, because if you have a greater slope during like rainfall events, the rainfall is going to have a greater velocity when going down that hill. So there's going to be more erosion, and lots of cesium is going to be attached to the negatively charged O horizon. So the O horizon is going to be washed away, and the cesium it contains will be moved to a new site. And then part of my research also focuses on the iolite and the clays that I was talking about, which I don't have the data for today, but my hypothesis for that part is that in low potassium environments, soils with higher iolite will have less cesium through the vegetation, because if there's no potassium, the cesium is going to fill those sites in the clays. And once the cesium is in there, it's pretty much immobilized, so the plants aren't going to be able to uptake it as easier. So it's still there, but it's not available for the plants. Okay, so how I selected these sites. This is the same picture of the soil, potassium, and the cesium that I showed earlier. And then there's one area where the trend doesn't fit perfectly, which is this black box right here. So normally we see these larger red circles, which is the more cesium, in the blue areas with low potassium. But here we're seeing large amounts of cesium in areas with medium to high potassium, so it doesn't fit perfectly with the trend, and we wanted to look at that further. So that was my area of interest. So the USGS has a mapped bedrock layer, and I used that on ArcGIS to show the major and minor bedrock components at different sites, since bedrock is such an important factor for soil forming. And I found areas in the southeastern Tennessee area where the bedrock is expected to contain low iolite, since one of my goals was to find a low, medium, and high iolite sites so I can compare that trend. And I did this by looking for rocks with relatively low potassium, low aluminum, and low SiO4, since iolite is going to contain all of these elements, and also low rates of chemical weathering. So iolite and other clays are products of chemical weathering, so I wanted to find areas where that wasn't as likely. Two other sites, one of which I'll talk about today. One is Dolly Sods, West Virginia. I have one blueberry foliage sample from there, and that's on a sandstone and conglomerate bedrock area, and that slope is about 0.05, so it's pretty much flat there. And I sampled in the college woods as well, but I don't have that data yet. The samples are still being dried out because it was raining once again. And the college woods are on the coastal plain, so we expect medium to high iolite here. And we collected multiple soil and vegetation samples, just like we did in Tennessee. And the slope is also pretty flat, it's 0.04. And this is what the sampling site looked like there. You can tell it's pretty flat. So this is a closer look at our Tennessee research area. We found some like public access trails so we could get to the sites really easily. So on the left is one of the trails that we hiked on. It was Gee Creek Trail, and we sampled at 3 different sites. And each of these colors on the map represents a different major bedrock component. So on the left, this red area is dolostone, green is quartzite, and C is conglomerate, and then the sites are named accordingly for the bedrock. And just to see if there's a trend between slope and elevation, all of those are marked for the sites as well. And on the right, we traveled to a different trail called Rock Creek Trail, and this has site G because the bedrock was gray wacky in this area, and the slope and elevation is shown there as well. So these are 4 sites that we sampled in Tennessee, and we got multiple vegetation and O-horizon samples from each. So some of the methods, we collected soil and vegetation from each site. And then in Tennessee, we were expecting low clay content. So about half of the sites had just bedrock with O-horizon on top, but then some of them ended up having some clays and a soil profile. So when that occurred, we took the soil profile like in this picture, and we separated by horizon into Ziploc bags. And then it was raining while we collected the vegetation and stuff. So when we got back to William Mary, we put it out in bags to dry. And then I used the grinding mill and Keck to basically grind up all the vegetation and O-horizons into like powder essentially. And then we can put them in the gamma spectrometer to find cesium-137. And then if there were any clays or horizons other than O, we will use X-ray diffraction to analyze for iolite content. So my preliminary results, this is just looking at the vegetation from Tennessee, so not the O-horizons yet, since I haven't looked at all of them. But the graph on the left shows all the data and its plant type versus the cesium that we found in it. So I had about, I think there's like 15 to 20 samples, and all the plants are on the bottom. And then the cesium is shown on the left. And the columns are also color-coded by site. So you can see the first 3 in yellow are from site C, the next 4 from site D, etc. So we can see that generally it's obvious that some sites have more cesium than others. Like site C, for example, in yellow has a lot more than Q, which is in green. But even within each site, there's a lot of variation. So like looking at site C with the yellow, fir is collecting a lot more cesium than like tulip poplar, for example. So this chart on the right shows the average cesium at each site, but it's not the entire picture because we can see that it generally decreases as we go from C to Q, but then the variation or the standard deviation, which is these black bars, is so high at each, just because there's so much variation within each site. So to kind of take a closer look, I just mapped tulip poplar between the 3 sites because tulip poplar was shown at Q, G, and C in Tennessee. It wasn't at D, but this was the one that was most across all of them. And we can see that even though Q had the lowest cesium overall on the previous graph, tulip poplar was still collecting more here than at G. So this leads us to believe that plants might uptake cesium at different rates. So by looking at one plant, we can see that this doesn't match the data from the last slide. There is evidence of a biological control there. So the plant species do make a difference. So plant type clearly has some influence on cesium-137 uptake, but overall site Q still had the least cesium cycling overall, and it also had the greatest slope. So that could be an influence there. And site C and Dolly sods, which is where we got that blueberry sample, had really high cesium in the vegetation, and they both were on a conglomerate bedrock. So conglomerate might also influence higher cesium in the vegetation, which we could investigate further. My next steps would be to finish analyzing my O-horizons from Tennessee and then look at some trends there. And then after the samples from the college woods are done drying, I can once again put those through the grinding mill and then use gamma spectrometry to look at the vegetation and the O-horizons. And then I can use X-ray diffraction for iolite content, and that needs to be done for the Tennessee sites as well as the college woods. And thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm sorry about, I was answering my door. Everyone, what a great job, Kathleen. Thank you very much. Yay. Anybody have questions for Kathleen? You can take them from the audience and I'll take them from the chat.
Delaney?
How do you use the X-ray diffraction to analyze for iolite? Like,
So each mineral gives off a different peak during X-ray diffraction. So like iolite's just going to give off a specific peak, and then you just find the area of that compared to the others, which we will do later.
Kathleen, could you repeat the question too? So
Sorry,
that again.
Delaney asked how you use X-ray diffraction to check for iolite in the samples.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Have there been any results so far that like you really weren't expecting, or that kind of made you think about something different?
Yeah, so Rachel asked if there were any results that I didn't expect or made me think different. So honestly, I was very surprised by the quartzite bedrock having low cesium. I expected there to be a lot. But looking at like if the slope could be a factor, I guess that could explain it. And then something that I was expecting, but not to the extent, is that the O horizons that we have collected so far have at least 10 times more cesium than their corresponding vegetation. And I knew it would be higher, but I didn't expect that much of an increase, honestly. Yeah. Rowan?
This is on me because I came in late, but when you're sampling the plants, how are you sampling a whole plant, a section of a plant?
We're just taking the leaves. So we'll take one species like sassafras, for example, and we'll get it from a couple of different plants in the area, just in case like something's wrong with one plant or it has a lot more cesium than the other. And we'll just take the leaves and we'll put it in a Ziploc bag and take them back, grind them up.
So do you have tree species that differ in terms of how frequently they lose their leaves? So thinking of the fir tree versus the deciduous trees, could that be part of what's happening? Your fir tree, you know, some of them lose their pine needles pretty frequently, some of them don't. I'm wondering if that could be
That
some of the biological
is something good to consider. I don't know if that makes a huge difference because with the vegetation, we wanted to collect it from the trees versus like just falling on the ground, because if a leaf is about to die or fall off, the tree is going to start to take up those nutrients that the leaf has. So they're not just like wasted away and dying. So my best guess would be that if a leaf is about to fall off, the tree would still take the cesium back into it and just start giving it to the new vegetation. But I think that is something important to consider as well. Linda?
Hi, I guess I'm playing off that question because I was wondering about the even the bark of the tree, if it, because as that tree is growing, it's uptaking that cesium 137, I'm guessing. And if bark samples might be something to see if there's differences between tree species or that kind of thing.
That is very interesting. I don't think I know enough about trees to give a best guess, but that would be cool to look at. Any other questions?
Anyone on Zoom want to ask a question?
Neil?
Just out of curiosity, do you know like what the processes of, like, you mentioned that it was like rain and precipitation that brought cesium from like the West Coast kind of all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know why it's ended up in such high concentrations in certain parts?
There's a lot of evidence that it proves just how much precipitation was in that area. So most of the distribution was just determined by the amount of precipitation in that area. So like in like Tennessee right there, they just received a lot more precipitation than other areas. It's not like perfectly explained by that, but that's the best way to describe the distribution.
Any more questions, folks? Okay, let's give a big hand to Kathleen. Thank you, Kathleen.